On the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, a Confederate cannonball tore through the lower leg of a Union Major General as he sat on horseback near the peach orchard. His name was Daniel Sickles, and within the hour he would be carried into a canvas field hospital to face the same fate as tens of thousands of soldiers under his command. Like almost every man who fought in the American Civil War, Sickles had heard the rumors that traveled through every camp on both sides of the line, that the field surgeons were butcher happy. That pile after pile of severed limbs stacked outside the surgical tables was a death sentence, that once you passed through that tent flap, you rarely came out alive. For over 150 years, popular culture has fed us the exact same story about 19th century military medicine. You've seen it in the movies, in the campfire legends, in the dramas. The narrative is always identical. A screaming soldier, wide awake, pinned down by his comrades. A surgeon exhausted, indifferent, blade in hand, sawing through bone as fast as possible. A leather strap clamped between the patient's teeth so he doesn't bite through his own tongue. We call these doctors butchers. We picture the 1860s as a barbaric dark age where human life was cheap and medical science barely existed. Here's the uncomfortable truth, that cinematic nightmare is almost entirely a lie. When you open the actual medical records of the era, specifically the massive 6-volume archive compiled after the war by Union Surgeon General Joseph Barnes, a very different picture emerges. Far from being senseless butchery, Civil War field surgery was a calculated, life-saving intervention. Surgeon Thomas Sims amputated Sickles' leg above the knee that very day. Within 2 months, Sickles had returned to duty. He would go on to live another 51 years. And in one of the strangest footnotes in American medical history, he personally donated the bones of his own severed leg to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, and for decades afterward returned every year on the anniversary of his amputation to visit them. Immediately after the war ended in 1865, the Surgeon General's office began a monumental task: collecting every field record, hospital ledger, casualty list, and doctor's journal from both sides of the conflict. The result was a 6-volume, multi-thousand-page work titled The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. Not personal memoirs, not sensationalized news accounts written months later, cold, hard, empirical data, cataloging over 174,000 gunshot wounds and roughly 30,000 documented amputations. It remains, to this day, one of the most comprehensive surgical datasets ever compiled. Out of every 4 men who stepped onto an operating table in a Civil War field hospital, roughly 3 of them walked out alive. For a procedure modern audiences picture as a medieval death sentence performed in filth, that number seems almost impossible. To understand how, we have to dismantle the three biggest myths about Civil War surgery, one by one. Let's address the most pervasive myth first, the idea that soldiers felt every bite of the saw. Ether had been publicly demonstrated in Boston in 1846, and chloroform was adopted shortly after. By the time the war began, American doctors had been using general anesthesia for over a decade. More than 95% of 80,000 plus documented Union operations were performed under chloroform or ether. A surgeon's assistant would pour liquid chloroform drop by drop onto a folded cloth or hollow sponge cone, held over the soldier's nose and mouth. Within 2 to 3 minutes, the man was completely unconscious. Not groggy, not drunk on whiskey, out cold. So where did the leather strap myth come from? Those straps and wooden blocks were airway management tools, used to stop an unconscious patient from reflexively biting his own tongue while under chloroform. And what about the horror stories of unmedicated operations? They did happen, almost always during catastrophic localized supply shortages, when the wounded from battles like Gettysburg or Antietam arrived faster than the chloroform could be resupplied. Those brief, traumatic windows were so viscerally awful that soldiers wrote about them obsessively in post-war memoirs. Over time, historians pulled disproportionately from those accounts, turning the rare exception into the remembered rule. To understand why surgeons amputated so frequently, you have to understand the weapon they were fighting. The Minié ball was a heavy, half-pound cylinder of soft, unjacketed lead. When it hit a human arm or leg, it didn't just pierce tissue, it mushroomed, crushed muscle, and shattered bone on contact. A bullet striking a femur could splinter 6 inches of solid bone into dozens of jagged shards. In 1863, there was no orthopedic surgery, no pins, no plates, no antibiotics to fight a deep bone infection. Leaving a shattered limb in place meant an escalating risk of gangrene and fatal blood infection within days. Amputation wasn't a lazy doctor's first choice. It was the only life-saving intervention available in 19th century medicine. Myth number 2, the 24-hour race against time. Critics at the time accused field doctors of rushing men onto operating tables with unnatural haste. But speed wasn't cruelty. It was a calculated race against a biological clock, surgeons understood, even if they didn't know why it existed. Primary amputation, within 24 hours. 74% survival rate upper limb amputations, fingers, wrists, forearms. 85–90% survival rate. Secondary amputation, delayed days or weeks. Mortality more than double. In extreme cases, thigh or hip amputations saw death rates climb past 70 to 80%. The exact same injury, the exact same surgeon, the exact same tools. The only variable was time. Surgeons worked through brutal, exhausting shifts, operating on hundreds of men back to back because they understood, without understanding why, that every hour of delay was a death sentence for the man on the stretcher. If roughly 3/4 of amputees survived, what killed the rest? Popular myth blames the shock of the saw or blood loss on the table, but death during the operation itself was rare. The real killer was something completely invisible to every person in that tent. In 1862, Joseph Lister had not yet published his work on antiseptic surgery. Louis Pasteur was only beginning his early experiments on fermentation. Germ theory did not exist in American medical science. Surgeons judged cleanliness purely by what they could see with their eyes. A doctor would rinse his hands in a shared bucket of water, wipe his scalpel on an apron, and move directly to the next patient. Surgical sponges were rinsed in shared basins and reused dozens of times. Many surgeons took a strange pride in a stiff, blood-stained operating coat, treating the stains as a badge of hard-earned experience. They weren't negligent. By the standards of 1862, they were acting entirely logically. They were simply catastrophically missing one piece of information. Hospital gangrene, 46% mortality, pyemia, blood poisoning, 97% mortality. Hospital gangrene was a bacterial flesh infection that could destroy tissue within days. But pyemia, what we now call systemic blood poisoning, was almost always fatal. Of 2,118 documented Union cases, only 71 men survived. The surgeons saw didn't kill these men. Microorganisms did, fighting a battle against an enemy the surgeons didn't know existed, using tools that unknowingly helped that enemy spread. What happened to the tens of thousands of men who survived those tents? They didn't disappear into history as tragic footnotes. Out of roughly 30,000 amputations performed in the Union Army alone, more than 22,000 men went home to rebuild a broken nation. Farming, working trades, raising families, some marching in veterans' parades decades later. And Daniel Sickles, the general who feared the surgeon's tent as much as any private under his command, became one of the era's strangest symbols of survival. He returned to active duty within 2 months of losing his leg. He served in Congress. He lived until 1914, more than half a century after that cannonball took his leg at Gettysburg. For years, he made a pilgrimage to the Army Medical Museum, to a small wooden case holding the bones of his own leg, preserved exactly where he had sent them. He wasn't visiting a grave. He was visiting the place where a Civil War surgeon, working in a canvas tent with a saw and a bottle of chloroform, had given him 51 extra years of life. Civil War surgeons were not butchers operating in barbarism. They were overworked pioneers, operating at the outer edge of human knowledge in the 1860s, men who instituted triage, popularized general anesthesia, and saved tens of thousands of lives under impossible conditions. They were simply caught in a tragic 2-decade gap between battlefield necessity and the discovery of germ theory. That's the truth behind the myth. That's the door we open tonight. Thank you for stepping through the 13th door. If you value evidence-based history and unvarnished truth, hit subscribe, leave a comment below, and tell us which historical myth we should open next.